the recording going first, and I will give a brief introduction, turn it over to Glenn, and we'll go from there. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to the first of our three 2022 virtual conference webinars. I am your AFGA President, Victor Benz, and I'll be the moderator for this evening's event. This webinar format we are using will permit you to actively participate and ask questions. Please use the raise hand function to signal your desire to contribute to the discussion. As the moderator, I'll recognize you and I'll try and have tried to promote you to panelist, but I also have found out that I can allow you to speak from being a meeting attendee as well, so we'll try that. I'll ask you to, you'll be able to unmute yourself, identify yourself, and say your piece. We have with us here Mr. Glenn Heather, the AFGA Environment Chair, and he will be hosting this open environment roundtable. I'll now turn the webinar over to Glenn to introduce his session and what he's looking to get out of the session. Glenn?
Yes. Hey, well, thanks for attending. Really appreciate you folks taking time out of your evening to attend this. As Victor mentioned, this was our first attempt as the AFGA to kind of share information, get our membership's opinions on items, start that open discussion that just to get an understanding what's important to our membership. So I'm hoping that we'll actually have more people attending to get more information or discussion. But actually my intention of this meeting was to make it very, very informal. Just an opportunity for anyone that has joined the meeting to actually give what they believe is important to them. So if you live in a certain area, what environment items are concerning to you? What do you believe Alberta Fish and Game should do to try to keep our habitat for our future? And basically pretty open for discussion related to environment and habitat. So that was the intention. Again, as time goes on, we hope to do more of these, but this is our first crack at trying to have meetings like this. So yeah, again, really informal. The intent is to get your opinions on what you believe the Alberta Fish and Game should focus on for the environment. If there's any specific land or habitat that you believe is going the wrong way through Alberta Fish and Game or through Alberta government, through programs, whatever, let me know what you would like us to work on. And that is the intent. So I will open the floor for anyone that would like to give me your opinion on what you believe is important related to habitat or the environment.
Well, we already have one hand up, and that's Gordon Poirier. So you can unmute yourself, Gord, and let us know what you think.
Hello, Glenn, and thanks for taking this chair on. It's a important one. Anyway, cutting to the chase. Michael Short has a YouTube video on the possibility of clear cutting the northern slopes off Chip Lake. And
wow.
That's a fairly popular area close to Edmonton. Lots of hunting and fishing in there done. There's grazing leases, trapping. Bill Abercrombie is a trapper, registered trapper in the area. There's some AT trappers in the area. World record non-typical mule deer buck came from that area. So important environmentally. If anybody's listened to Michael Short's Facebook thing, there are a couple things in there that don't sit quite right. The way example is the way It's agriculture and forestry work. They supposedly asked for asked for bids on this land and on the trees, and it doesn't seem quite right. However, I think you should be, being as it's in Victor's backyard, investigating and find out how this is going through. There's a lot of opposition to it. There probably would have been more opposition if the government would have been clear, transparent on their consultations. We know that's a bad word for government, consultations. They don't like to do it. But nonetheless, that's the first, that's a good topic to get you started. Thank you.
Thanks. Hey, Gordon, thank you very much. So of course, we knew nothing of this. That's why we wanted to hear what is so, and you say it's Michael Shorten's got a YouTube. If I went on his YouTube, there be something there on this so I could try to get more details?
I believe so.
Okay.
That's where I saw it.
Okay, I will check that out and try to get more information and start from there. Yeah, a good point. This is what we want to hear is, in everyone's backyard, something could be happening. And, we're not getting and you mentioned the magic word, transparency, for us to know what's going on. So that is perfect, Gordon. I will, I'll take a look at that. And so what I plan to do as I get these, this information, I plan to research it. And then in one of the magazine articles, I'll kind of go up and I'm going to, what I heard from each person that's giving me information. And then I'll try to give an update, what I found out. And then go from there. But that's my intention, is to research each one of these. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. And you're absolutely right. That's in my backyard. It's an area that I've spent a fair bit of time in, and clear cutting that would be a real disaster. So getting questions, whether you want to comment on what Gordon has just told us, or whether you have some of your own issues that you wish to share with Glenn and myself, please raise your hand and I'll recognize you, allow you to talk, and we'll go from there. Mitchell, go ahead, please.
I guess what I would like to bring up is the environmental impacts from the wind turbines.
Okay.
So it's anything from degrade habitat, from wildlife to fish, plants. The spinning turbine blades can pose a threat to flying wildlife like birds and bats. So that's a pretty major one that you're starting to hear more of that coming in the area with these turbines, and it's getting to be quite an issue in the area here. My area and then other areas too.
And your area, Mitchell, is?
St. Paul. So that would
Okay.
be St. Paul Elk Point area. So northeastern Alberta.
Yeah, I've been aware of the fact is that there's no quick, easy solution to renewable energy or renewable energy sources. It's always a trade-off. And one of the ones that has really become apparent along the western slopes, in particular with wind turbines, is the significant bat die-off, or the bats that are found at the base of some of those wind turbines. And they believe that it's due to the rapid change in pressure that attracts the bat with respect to its sonar capability, and then does the bat in when the bat gets close to the turbine blades. So that's quite a significant one. Thanks for bringing that up.
Absolutely. Yes. So what I'll try to do. So as you folks know, resources like solar and wind is definitely, where the world seems to want to go away from fossil fuels. So I don't think we can stop that. However, I will research and try to find out if, I mean, numerous European countries have been doing this for eons already. You know, is there any way you can lessen the impact related to wind turbines? But yes, no, let me see if I can find anything out. As far as wind turbines, I mean, I can only speak in the southern Alberta area. They're popping up everywhere. There is no perfect solution. It's green energy, if you want to say, but it comes at a cost.
Yeah.
And that being, birds and bats and stuff like that. So let me see what I can find out. And if there is, let's say there has been a country that has lessened the impact, well, then I would share that with AAP and try to see if, whatever they implemented, if that would be our new standard.
Yeah, and then one more thing as well too with these turbines, that it gets to be like for landowners and neighbors that for permission to hunt, you can't hunt on land with the turbine without getting permission from the turbine company. So that's taken away rights of landowners where, you've lost that right to hunt on your own land, and you got to ask permission to do so. So
yes, no doubt, another access issue. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Mitchell. That's perfect.
Anyone else? Oh, there, Gord's back up. Go ahead, Gord.
Yeah, this is, we live up in Bonnyville area, northeast of St. Paul. And recently, again, this goes to transparency of governments. We discussed it at our Zone 5 meeting, and Victor knows about it. He gave some good advice, and it's advice that everybody listening could use. We have, in this area, we have one AEP, or Alberta Parks and Environment police officer, if you would call him that. Peace officer is what they call. And he runs at least 4 counties, and sometimes 8 counties. So if something's happening out in the environment, he is unlikely to find out about it by himself. He needs us to work as watchers. We have to watch the environment because the government is not paying anybody to do it. So it's, I mean, we get a good benefit from the environment. So it's up to us to stay on it, look after it. We're in the bush at least 3 months of the year, more, and we can see things that other people don't. We see changes because we've been in that bush for years and years. We've walked it, talked it, picked berries. And when we see a change, we notice it. Somebody new coming in might not notice that as a change. They might think it was always there, it was always done this way. So we have to continue to be observant and not afraid to report things to the government, to the officers. And as Victor said, you also have to watch your MD, your own community, your county and municipal district people, because some of the regulations that they put out are not very helpful for the environment. They're meant for industry and tax money. So thank you again.
No, thanks, Gordon. No, it's fantastic. So true. Yes, and that's the beauty of the Alberta Fish and Games organization is there should be some level of power in numbers. So when we would hear of something and share, we hopefully should get some answers, if nothing else, but we have to let them be aware that we're around. So very good point.
if you don't mind, Glenn, I'll expand a little bit on
Yes.
what Gordon said. I've been involved for quite a few years on working with a group of people on the North Raven River to try to avoid a below water table gravel pit adjacent to the springs that create the North Raven River. And literally adjacent, I mean, the gravel pit would be within a few hundred yards of the springs. And I've learned a great deal in this journey that I didn't know. One of the more expensive operations that a county can undertake is to deal with appeals on development permits that are given out by its planning and development department. And this has become particularly true with gravel pits. Nobody wants a gravel pit, gravel trucks driving by their house. Nobody wants the noise of a gravel pit crusher or a gravel pit classifier, so on and so forth. So what many counties have started to do, and this is something that is worth checking in your own county because you'll be surprised. What many counties have done is they've created what is called gravel overlay districts. Each county has a slightly different word for it, but it essentially creates a special map that identifies all the potential major gravel deposits and then allows, rather than the planning department, development and planning department, it allows the county councilors themselves to approve gravel extraction development permits. The advantage for the county is that these permits are unappealable. And then at the time, then the company that would get that uncontested appeal or uncontested development permit would take it to the provincial government, to AEP, to get additional approvals that they require from AEP. Well, AEP has also done its part in this, and up until quite recently, maybe a year ago, they would refuse to entertain any application from a prospective developer unless they already had the county development permit in hand. That has changed 180 degrees. Today, a developer can first go to AEP and apply for a permit for gravel extraction, and particularly for water diversion that very likely will be needed in most gravel pits, get approval there, and then pursue approval through the county for the actual development permit. And more counties have been going to the gravel overlay district mode, which puts the permission or the granting of that development permit in the hand of county council, not the development department, and that's unappealable. And suddenly there's a gravel pit next door. Now, there's been an interesting development in this story in Red Deer County. Red Deer County was one of the first counties to go this way, and landed up approving a expansion of a gravel pit essentially right on the edge of the Red Deer River in an area that had already been identified as environmentally sensitive. Residents eventually tried to fight it in county council, were basically told, too bad, so sad, this is unappealable, there's nothing you can do. And they were very successful because they took it to Court of Queen's Bench on a judicial review of the decision made by council in this matter. And not only, and normally all you can expect in a judicial review is a hand slap on the county and saying, you didn't do it according to your rules, go back and do it properly. But what happened in this particular case is, in addition to doing that, the judge in the case ruled the bylaw, the land use bylaw that created this gravel overlay district in this particular area, invalid and voided the bylaw. What's interesting is that Red Deer County tried to pretend that didn't happen and was caught on that as well. And it's become quite an issue in the Red Deer area on this topic. So this is an example of be aware of what's going on in your own area, because there are things like this occurring that are moved through the county process for rejuvenation of land use bylaws without a lot of fanfare. And suddenly the ground rules have completely changed compared to what they were a few years before. So for example, the North Raven River sits in Clearwater County, and Clearwater County is trying to bring in that kind of gravel overlay district there as well, which is something we're watching very, very carefully with respect to the North Raven River. So that's just an example of what Gordon was talking about. Anyone else have got any questions or want to make any comments?
I see a question from Elizabeth so I'll read it.
Oh, okay, sorry, good.
Yeah. What are our thoughts on wild horses, and do they affect the habitat of the antelope and other native hoofed mammals? Good question, Elizabeth. So wild horses, now so we actually have had 2 members of the Alberta Fish and Game on the advisory kind of team for many, many years. So wild horses, I guess, what is our approach on wild horses? So first of all, they're not, well, they're wild horses, but they're truly not wild horses. So they were actually imported many, many years ago and became feral, and the population increased. So for many years, we've been saying there should be X number of horses in certain areas and they should be managed. What's happened is their numbers have increased quite significantly. And what the Alberta Fish and Game is truly worried about is really the habitat. Horses actually do a lot of damage. And so, for instance, in the Suffield block down here in southern Alberta, there was a population of wild horses. They were taken feral. Sorry, I should say feral. Yes, that's right. They were feral horses. Nicely put. Yes, they were doing more damage to the habitat than what 8,000 elk were. In the way they eat, they actually tend to pull the roots out of the grass. They tend to trample, and in the wild, these feral horses are they're pretty possessive about their range. So I've not seen or been around a lot of them, but I'm told by many people that spend their times up in that Sundre area, if there is a band of feral horses, you are not going to find moose, you're not going to find elk, deer in their habitat area, that they kind of take control. So what is Alberta Fish and Game's approach to feral horses is that they should be managed, that there should be a system to allow a set number that's agreed upon for sustaining feral horses. The challenge is, as everyone knows, horses are a very popular animal. They're a pet. They're used for different, so certain organizations and horses, they're pretty passionate. So they believe that they are wild horses, that they belong in Alberta's landscape. We're not saying they don't belong in the Alberta landscape because they're here already. But they're basically, a lot of the organizations are saying, just let them go, not have a management control system on it. Alberta Fish and Game is about managing items. I would say we're not extremists. We just believe there should be management systems for every kind of fish or wildlife within the Alberta province. So we're quite concerned that the numbers are going to not be managed, because sadly, to manage the numbers, well, I mean, killing them is certainly not something that the public nor anyone wants within the horse area. To capture them is possible, and then they can be given out to anyone that would like to take them. There was also a sterilization program that was tried where they were actually injecting the mares. It kind of worked, but it didn't kind of work because they're hard to catch and tranquilize and use this too. So we're actually quite concerned about the feral horse population. We're continuing to voice that they need to be managed. There has been this committee that has talked about it. They have kind of come back and said, well, don't quote me on the numbers, but there's roughly 1,800 feral horses. They've agreed that that would be the number that would be sustained. Personally, the Alberta Fish and Game believes that number should have been much, much, much lower, because that was agreed upon years ago to be a smaller number. But we're prepared to say, okay, fine, we'll agree to that number. What's your management plan to keep that number? And that's where it's been kind of hung up right now. So that's kind of our approach right now. Sadly, it's a very passionate subject for both sides of the kind of the fence here. The pro horse, which basically believe that they should be left unmanageable. And then we also have another degree of the other side of the fence where there's quite a few people and organizations that would like to see them reduced or taken off the landscape. We just want to have a management system, know what it is, and how is it going to be sustained.
So Glenn, I have two questions. I've got one hand raised by our fishing chair, Daryl Smith, but I do have a question from Brett Calverley of Spruce Grove that's on the chat, which I'll read first, and then I will open Daryl's mic and allow him to initially respond to Brett's question and then talk about the question that he actually raised his hand about. So Brett says, I am with the Spruce Grove Club, and we have a member who lives in Calgary and is very concerned about the health of the rivers with headwaters in the east slope. Comments, and I do believe that Daryl is in a better position to answer this, so I'm going to throw it over to you, Daryl. Go ahead and unmute yourself and go for it.
Well, my question was going to be, or my comment was going to be similar, and it was related to water. And so in terms of Brett's comment, so the issue is that most of the water in Alberta does arise in those headwaters along the east slopes and in the mountains. I guess we're fortunate in that that is public land. It's not private land as a general rule. And of course, some of it is in the national parks. I think that the real issue, though, is that what we need to ensure is that the land use planning process that's in place ensures that those headwater streams, those watersheds are protected. Unfortunately, Alberta has not completed all the land use planning processes that are in place. For example, the Upper Athabasca, the Upper Peace, those haven't even been started. The other ones, like the South Saskatchewan, have been completed. There's, of course, a lot of potential impacts in those areas, but without having those land use planning processes complete and to ensure that the necessary conditions are in place to protect that headwaters. And those is that I think it should be a concern for everybody. I think AFGA's position would be that, well, I know what our position is that we need to complete those land use planning processes because that'll be the basis from which development will take place. Glenn, you can jump in.
Oh, no, thank you, Daryl. Again, your expertise on this is second to none. So no, I don't have anything to add. I think that's excellent. Again, as Daryl mentioned, we as well are very concerned about, access and the use of the waters. So yeah, no, I guess in summary, I really have nothing to add.
Okay, well, I'll jump in with the one that I wanted to bring up. And
okay.
I think most people probably know that there is a wetlands policy for Alberta that was introduced a number of years ago. Essentially what that wetland policy says is that it classifies wetlands and wetlands that exist, even if they exist on private land, are then owned by the Crown. And while wetlands can be drained on private land, they also requirement that if you drain them, that you need to replace them. There has to be a mitigation strategy and a permitting strategy. However, I guess what I'm seeing, particularly in the piece and elsewhere in my travels, is that with industrial agriculture, I think that's the only way I can describe it. And I'll make it clear that my own family are involved in the agriculture industry as well, fairly large scale. So I know how they farm and how they work to protect the land. On the other hand, what I'm seeing up here is basically drainage and leveling of the land and removal of all of the, well, basically what were features on the landscape, trees, wetlands, bogs, and it seems to be intensifying. A lot of these were areas that were subject to what we call sheet water, but these sheet water used to form in the spring. Then they used to slowly drain, fill the other related wetlands that were in the area. And I think that it's a really critical issue because while we're talking about the east slopes, with climate change and what's going on, this rapid runoff that's occurring from these drainage plans, basically it's rapid runoff that's occurring, get the land dry earlier, but at the same time, the reverse also happens is that the water, it dries up, but if you don't get water, you don't have that groundwater recharge and the groundwater in it. And for me, it's I think it's probably one of the most critical things in our white zones that I think that the AFGA needs to be aware of. And you don't want to pit yourself against the agricultural community, but considering that the policy is in place, it seems to me that the government has a role of enforcing those rules. And quite frankly, maybe we're not aware of it, that it's being enforced, but I think that this was a very important policy that many people spent a lot of time on. I think it's important that we ensure that that policy there, because at the end of the day, water, whether it lies in the headwaters or comes off of our private lands, is what we all drink. It sustains a lot of our wildlife, and I think it's something that we need to be really concerned about.
Thank you, Daryl.
Yes, thank you. I will read that policy. And then, yes, let me, we'll put up a little concern to our AAP partners.
So we have another question. So I should emphasize, you can either use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen to enter questions, although I'm not sure that everyone can see those questions, or you can use your raise hand function, which will be in your reactions section along the bottom line, and just raise a hand to and I will see it here, and I will allow you to speak to us and answer the question. So I've got a question here from Gordon Smareka from, I'm pretty sure you're from St. Paul. And I'll take this one on if you don't mind, Glenn.
Go for
Why are
it.
cattle allowed to graze on leased land that borders lakes? Shouldn't a buffer zone be around the lake? And specifically here, I'm referring to Keowin Lake in northeastern Alberta. Again, the issue here that is really at the heart of this is in most cases we're dealing with private land, quite often that was purchased long before any of the regulations that we brought in are available to us. And the net result is that you have situations exactly as you describe, where in that zone right at the edge of the lake, you have cattle grazing, degrading the land, affecting the water retention, runoff, and native growth in that area. What's been happening, particularly in southern Alberta, where it's been a bit more of an issue, Gordon, is there's been an involvement with a group called Cows and Fish, and they take on specific projects like this, and they work with the farmers and ranchers and anyone else who's directly affected along the edge of the shore, and work towards getting agreement on setbacks such as you're proposing. And I know one area that's been very successful for that in our area has been Pigeon Lake, which was really a disaster waiting to happen with the blue-green algae blooms and so on. And Cows and Fish in particular, there and in Gull Lake as well, have had a tremendous impact with the local communities to improve that riparian zone right along the edge of the lake. So I would suggest that that's a group you may want to get a hold of. Okay. I think, Andy, I can say that yes, the wetlands do include the ephemeral wetlands. You're talking about essentially the ones that aren't there year round. It's intended to do that, but it's becoming a much more difficult one to manage. And again, going back to what we'd mentioned earlier, we rely heavily on people like yourself to get out there, identify these problems, start talking to either the AFGA, but especially your own councillors, your MLA, and in fact, as well, AEP, that if there are wetlands being drained and you're very concerned about it, that's the route to go, is to bring it forward and get discussion. And we will help you as much as we can. I mean, that's one of the roles that Glenn has, but we'll go from there. So, Brett, did we answer your question that you've got there? Thank you, Daryl. How is the AFGA's position being voiced within the land use planning process? Daryl. Okay, there you go, Daryl. Go ahead, Daryl.
Yeah, so what I was just going to comment before I get to that land use planning question is that ephemeral water bodies are part of the wetland policy. And basically the wetland policy says that semi-permanent surface water that is present throughout and I'm just reading off the wetland policy, so and it's actually off the Public Lands Act as well, that their surface water is present throughout the majority of the growing season, but usually is dry by the end of the summer. So, you know, sloughs that form in the spring and they don't dry out to the end of summer into early fall are in fact claimable by the Crown, and as such are considered a Crown asset and are subject to the wetland policy. So that's just for clarity. And like what I said, it's a question of, well, are we actually enforcing that, or are we making all these land alterations going ahead? So in terms of engagement on those various plans, is yes, AFGA in the past, like the Lower Athabasca, the South Saskatchewan regional plan, did make submissions, as well as obviously clubs and members in the area made submissions. The North Saskatchewan planning process is out there, but basically, unless we know which planning processes are currently open and which ones they're taking submissions from, you know, we don't have a lot of input. So the ones that I'm concerned, well, I'm concerned about them all, but I'm particularly concerned about the Upper Athabasca and the Lower or Upper Peace. That's a very significant part of the province if you consider that the Athabasca watershed, it goes way south of Drayton Valley and all the way up the east slopes, and the Berlin River is sort of the cutoff, and then we hit into the Upper Peace, which then goes all the way practically to the Northwest Territories border. That's a pretty significant chunk of real estate without having an active planning process, you know, on the ground, and there's a lot of industry happening. So, you know, I think if my standpoint is that the AFGA should be pushing the government to get on with these planning processes, because they will set the direction for the next 20 or 30 years, because it's, you know, and I don't know when we started these things. I think it's around 2000. So, I mean, we've only got a couple really done. So that's, I would suggest that it's our track record of keep getting these completed perhaps isn't as good. So can I bring up one more thing?
Go ahead.
Because I think so there is an issue which I don't know if everyone's seen in the media, but it's not. So around Pigeon Lake, of course, there's the question of, again, a type of industrial agriculture that does need an approval process through the Natural Resources Board, and that's related to intensive livestock. And I think it somewhat goes to the same thing as, say, around Keewayan Lake. But it's also being as how important those riparian areas and how important those drainage areas are, because they are the filters that prevent, you know, both human and other natural sources of nutrients getting into our lakes and our rivers and whatever. And I think this whole question of, watershed protection, which gets really more complicated on private lands than it is necessarily, or a mix of private and public, should be a real concern for us. And I mean, that's why when I talk about agriculture, I mean, it's the industrial scale. It's not the mom and pops. In fact, I grew up at a time when, because of the mom and pop operations, the pheasant hunting in southern Alberta was among the best in the world. And that was because of the way agriculture was done in those days. But we basically sterilized our ditches, we sterilized our irrigation canals, we've sterilized the roadways, and that's had a pretty major impact, not only on the things that we hunt or the things that we fish, but also other birds and mammals and everything else. So, I think we have to think very carefully, where these type of agricultural practices are going to occur and what type of protection needs to be, on them. And I was just going to make one other comment about cows and fish, but also ACA and Fish and Wildlife, where we have managed to protect or secure some pretty significant shoreline access, or not shoreline access, riparian protection along some of our lakes in this province. So I'm thinking of like Monogamy Lake up in this country, Snipe Lake, where we had agriculture. But I don't see those programs that were really active back in the 80s, 90s, occurring to the same extent today. And perhaps that's what we need to do, invest in, is that, try to secure or work with the, the landowners to get those, the cattle back from those, lake shores or those rivers and streams, or have a plan where those cattle, like through the cows and fish, that they can get into those areas, but it's, for a short period of time and it's managed. So that's just a comment.
Thank you, Daryl. Mitchell, I noticed that you had your hand up earlier and it's gone down. So did you want to add something to the discussion?
No, Daryl's covered it. It was on the environmental end, but he's pretty much covered everything that I was going to speak to.
Thank you. Brett has another question in the chat. And that is, when AFGA purchases a property, it is inspected for prior wetland drainage, and following purchase, are these wetlands restored? Actually, quite a difficult question, because not all former wetlands can be restored depending on what use the land had. It also depends on the wishes of the donor of the land. And there's also an expense associated with that. So I would say that inspection, yes. Restoration of wetlands maybe start to become more of an emerging issue for us, but I would say it's not often done right now, to my knowledge. And that's, but you bring up an excellent point on what we've got there. Wade, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the right to speak, because I think I want to hear more about what you're talking about in your question. So,
okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Good. Yeah, so last fall, I believe there was a new act introduced to the legislature, and I believe it's still being brought through the legislature and is in process, and it's the Trails Act. And the way I understand it, and I can't say that I understand it completely, but I understand the topic pretty well. I'm from the Crowsnest Pass in Alberta, and I've worked land use issues and access management plans for the past 20 years or so. But the Trails Act is being brought forward to manage recreational access, mainly motorized access on Crown lands throughout the province. And what it will do is it will create a designated trail system throughout the province, so that the motorized recreation can be managed in a sustainable way, but it can also be used to enhance, perhaps maintain and enforce policies regarding those activities. And in some specific instances, you know, there is the potential that more access can be added if it's justifiable. So if obviously, I think you guys aren't super aware of it, but I think it's an important thing. We definitely need, you know, so I'll say, you know, in the past, I've been a motorized recreationalist. I have somewhat of a love-hate relationship with it, as we probably all have. You know, I mostly use ATVs and snowmobiles as a tool now, not so much as a recreational outlet, but you know, it's a tool that can enhance our hunting and fishing opportunities if used properly. And so that's the problem. You know, that's where we're at, is there's just so much volume of people using the landscape that it needs to be managed and enforced. But it also needs to be accommodated in some capacity as well.
Thanks, Wade. I am not familiar with the Trails Act, so I will look it up and investigate to see what they are proposing, and then we'll go from there. And then as far as AFGA's position, I guess once we see what they're looking for or proposing, we'll make, you know, we'll do a position on it. You know, AFGA is about access, and ATV or motorized vehicles are part of the access system. However, we are also sensitive to ensure that that is managed properly and that it doesn't wreck our habitat. So it's that magical balance. Sadly, if again, it's based on the enforcement. What we've probably missed over many, many years now is enforcement. And that's why, you know, motorized vehicles have got such a bad rap, is all it takes is a few bad actors to do a lot of damage. And then it says, it gets us to where the individuals or organizations are wanting to restrict access as a whole, as in the castle area and stuff like that. So thank you. Let me investigate the Trails Act and go from there.
If I could just add two things that you brought up. I agree that enforcement's a big thing with the, you know, the equation. Education and engineering go a long ways. A lot of trails are there by default and poorly designed. So this would create a system where, you know, if a trail is poorly located, there would be a revenue, a predictable revenue stream to change or reroute, make trails sustainable so that they are putting us in the right location. And that was one major point that I forgot to mention, is attached to this Trails Act is going to be some type of levy on motorized vehicles. It's basically a user pay system where those funds would be dedicated to the enforcement, enhancement, and regulation of motorized trails throughout the province.
Interesting. You know, again, that's a lot of good stuff, and that's, you know, to make trails accessible. It's just, finding out what kind of access they're actually proposing. You know, again, you know, we've got to this point where there has been no real management or control over ATV use or whatever, and it definitely has destroyed a lot of our habitat and areas. So no, Good. Thank you very much. Let me investigate that more.
Daryl, you wanted to make some comments?
Yeah, so AFGA was able to update, I think it was 2020, and I'll check on that and I'll make sure that Glenn's aware, but we did update our off-highway vehicle policy. Took about 3 years or 2 or 3 years of bringing it back. Okay. So what I've seen, and I haven't followed the Trail Act development in depth, but it's fairly consistent with that policy. AFGA's policy does say that we support designated routes. So that's that development of trails. And certainly from a fisheries perspective, I've seen some very severe damage associated with ATV crossings use that, quite frankly, doesn't represent the type of stewardship that I think that anglers and hunters, the ATV community would, should endorse. I mean, quite frankly, that's, we have to get past that. At the same time, I use them, I have them. I'm a little bit like you, is that I don't use them the way I did. Maybe it's because of my age, but I still believe that, with the proper rules, and hopefully that Trail Act will create those rules, but also the funding to do both the remediation work, but also to develop those trails so that, that group of individuals have a place that they can use them responsibly. And I think it all comes down to responsibility and stewardship and education. Enforcement is a big part of it too. But at the same time, it's up to us as individuals to do our part. And I will make sure that Glenn has the latest copy of those. I kind of look after the policies and positions. So sometimes I have them in the book and the updated copies. So that's just where it's at.
So before we move on to Mitchell, I'll just close this section with two areas that I'm familiar with. One is the Mackenzie Creek area, which is very close to the Cardinal River Mine, Tech Coal, Catamount Trails discussion. And this is a case where there is an existing ATV trail that was put in decades ago off the Forestry Trunk Road, basically section that leads towards Catamount, that went through several times, crossed Mackenzie Creek, and in several other places was actually immediately adjacent to it, causing runoff into Mackenzie Creek, which was destroying it as a natural place for laying the eggs for the Athabasca rainbow and for bull trout. And through a partnership with several of the industrial users in that area, that trail is being completely redone, moved away from the creek bed itself, proper bridges put into that trail at several locations where it needs to cross Mackenzie Creek. And I think it's really one of the true success stories for an area where we've got local clubs, industry sponsors, and AEP working together. Another one that I'll comment on that you may be aware of, Wade, is the Porcupine Hills test pilot for motorized access that occurred this past hunting season. that was less of a successful item. It was brought in a bit of a hurry, but there's a recreational access group that we have several members of the representing the AFGA sitting on that. And the one thing that happened in that session is it really, in that pilot case for this past hunting season, is it really identified a very clear need for a strong communication and for enforcement. So a good news story and a sort of good news story there. Mitchell, go ahead, please.
I guess back to the land and the draining of the wetlands and whatnot with farmers. And as long as that's the thing with farmers, when they have their land, the more acres they got, the more money they're going to make. So is that an avenue that can be good? And can Alberta Fish and Game, do they, like, what influence would we have with the government? Is there any way that the farmer can be compensated for the wetland on and keep it as at a natural state, and they're compensated for that land, for that marsh or them cattails or that little slough that's there? Is that something that has been thought of before, instead of them trying to drain their land and drain the 4 or 5 acres or more out of there, that they're compensated by Alberta government or whatever to keep what they have on their land, even trees and whatnot?
I have no history or knowledge of that, Daryl or Victor. I don't know if that's come up in the past. I have no information on that.
Is
So
that something? Okay, go ahead, Daryl.
yeah, so the issue related to easements, and there's a variety of ways that they could be put in place, tax incentives and that thing. I think, though, that anyone who owns agricultural land, a tax incentive isn't going to be a very large. Don't think that as agricultural, when land is designated for agricultural use, that the actual taxes are that significant on it, okay? Just the reality of the situation. Though in some jurisdictions, in other parts of North America, that wouldn't be the case. So, I mean, I think that everyone is looking at I think all organizations are looking at some type of way of perhaps compensating landowners to preserve wetlands, but not only wetlands, but other critical habitat on their land. And I think it's a discussion that needs to be undertaken soon. There's been a lot of discussions, say under the review of the Fisheries Act, I'm talking the Federal Fisheries Act, related to offset requirements. Okay, so so this is, if you have an industrial project, or say even a highway infrastructure project, and you have to, destroy a wetland, change a wetland, is that under the Act, there may be an offset requirement to replace it, 1, 2, 3-fold. And I mean, the discussion now is, more of an ecosystem-based situation. Well, we always had in-stream mitigation. So, if you had a pipeline crossing, you would have to offset that within the stream somewhere, okay? But we're talking, that riparian area and those, creating those offsets. So I think it's a really good point that you bring up, is that the importance of private land for both wildlife, fish, for water, for air, for all of us, is that I think that we need to look collectively at, how can we compensate a landowner so that it doesn't make sense for them to remove that land. And, I could speak about my own family who farms, is that you know, partly it's the size of the equipment now. I mean, you know, who thought 100+ foot air drills, you know, who thought that those would ever be, you know, on the land, you know, every little arable acre that you can bring in, potentially bring. But I will say that their experience is that actually taking those wetlands out of the their land, they very seldom, you know, it's 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 that they harvest them and, or, you know, actually get a crop on them. So, you know, they've recognized themselves that it's those wetland features are more important to leave on the landscape. So a long answer is that, yes, it's something I think that we need to, you know, push. We've certainly had some resolutions, particularly from down south, that have passed on this area issue of offset requirements. And, you know, I think that the reality is that an organization which ours, which has to look at, you know, economic, social, and environmental issues, is trying to find the right balance. And, you know, these wetlands are, you know, are places where, you know, they're carbon sumps. They catch a whole pile of nutrients, you know, and then slowly release it. So, I mean, they're really valuable to the environment. So keeping them on the landscape, some type of compensation program, I think would be, over the next decades, would be a very positive outcome.
Thanks very much for that, Daryl. Tanya, please unmute yourself.
Hi, I just wanted to say bye. I pressed it by accident after you said Mitchell was the last, so I just had a few questions. But next time I'll ask Glenn.
No, go ahead. We've still got 55 minutes in this session.
Oh, I thought you mentioned it was over. Okay.
No, what I was mentioning is it took me a long time to get to Mitchell because there were several people in the chat and so on and so forth. So it's your turn at the mic, Tanya. Please go ahead.
Well, I'm new to the game. You know, I'm 4 years into the firearms industry, so I do a lot of reading. And I was just, this all comes down to, I was thinking of, I'm not sure the name of it, but when you trap and you put into those coolers all over in Alberta to distinguish any problems with the animals, samples. I was wondering how that's going. I know there's a name for it, but I can't recollect at the moment what that's called.
The chronic wasting disease. Yes, where the heads of whitetail or mule deer are collected. Sadly, I don't have a final number of the CWD cases that were actually occurred last year. I do not have that number, but I certainly can find it. Or if I know, actually they had problems. The results were getting delayed by quite a bit. So I don't know if they've all been processed or not. Victor.
Thanks, Glenn. I can fill in a few blanks, but certainly not all of them, Tanya. This is a degenerative disease in ungulates, primarily mule deer and whitetail, but it has also shown up in elk and moose. There's a great deal of concern as it moves west that it may affect any plans for caribou recovery. The challenge that the Alberta government is facing is the testing program that's in place was designed to help them develop a strategy to address the problem, which has not really been all that successful, and there are no real answers as of yet. But many people who hunt in those areas were also taking advantage of the testing facilities to find out if their animal tested positive or negative, and then making a decision based on that, whether or not they would eat the meat from that animal. What's happened, particularly in this past hunting season, is the government has a limited ability to do the testing in any sense of a timeliness of results. And the net result is that they are now primarily focusing on that edge region where the disease seems to be spreading westward, and are less concerned and paying less attention to the areas that they know now for certain are have the infection, which is disturbing to many people who have been relying on the testing program to tell them whether the animal that they shot, the deer that they shot, was infected or not. So we're somewhat at cross purposes right now. And I have to say that from everything I've read, there are no easy, simple answers. I think a lot of people are placing hope, and there's various degrees of confidence that we're getting close to a vaccine. There are certainly differences in opinion across the board and across jurisdictions, between jurisdictions. And by that, I mean various states in the US, various provinces in Canada, as to what's the proper method to control the spread of the disease, and even if it can be controlled. So in a sense, we almost know less now than we ever did. And I really can't give you much more than that. I don't know if you've got any comments, Daryl.
Well, the only comment that I have is that the government did run into, I believe, some issues with their lab as well. And that's delayed testing as well. But I would concur with Victor, and I'm not speaking from Fish and Game standpoint, but being involved in the health field myself, is that the chance to control this disease was when it was very early, basically along our eastern borders. This is now a disease involving a number of ungulate species that is spreading westward and northward. So if you ever look at the distribution maps, but we're not alone. It's been discovered, of course, in Manitoba, many of the states. I believe it's in Idaho now, so it's moving west and stuff. So, I mean, it's when these animals are on the landscape, is that, and a disease is on the landscape, how long, or, what will be the impacts ecologically over a long period of time. I think it's also, everyone needs to recognize that this disease, which started in the Colorado, Wyoming, that was where it was first detected some 50, 60 years ago, it's been on the landscape there. I would think that one of the concerns that we really should have, though, is for those endangered species that aren't fast reproducers or slow reproducers, such as the woodland caribou populations. Probably need to take an approach to try to prevent the movement, into those areas. But I mean, I think Victor's totally right, is that, the vaccine, perhaps 5 years, but then the real issue is how do you get it to enough wild animals? It's difficult getting humans to take it. Well, I'm not totally sure how you would get it to all the wild animals, even if they wanted it. So, I mean, there's a lot of logistics. So I think it's something that we need to be aware of. It's something that hopefully with governments, academics, and come up with some type of both a transparent plan and how it's going to be managed. Like, I would like to know, like, what are the next 5 years? I don't like going from 1 year to a next, not knowing what's going to happen. So I think a bunch of those things, I think we need a really clear plan laid out. And, you know, one of the options might be to recognize that it's endemic on the landscape, and, you know, but we need to, we need to hear from the experts, you know, what is the best strategy?
Yes, thank you. I just talking about the wetlands and all, that's why I brought up the fact, just all these changes and movements and policies and changes and how that's going to affect environmentally. I was just thinking about that part and the animals and the disease. And I didn't really want, I know there's no answer quite, well, I didn't know actually, but I just wanted to hear, but it helped a lot hearing that. Thank you, gentlemen. I'll unmute now, or I'll mute. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya.
Yes, and thank you very much. And I see Brett also gave me a suggestion here of whom to contact. So I will do that. Thank you, Brett.
The thing we all have to admit, the 3 AFGA executive that you have on the meeting is really the person to answer this question is our hunting chair. And so we're sort of collectively filling in for them. Any other questions? Raise your hands or put a question in the chat, please.
Yes, and while we're waiting for someone to, so I can give a little bit of a good news story down in south. So when we're talking about setbacks or whatever, when the reservoirs were, of course, southern Alberta is heavily, most of our watersheds are actually irrigation based lakes. So when they were, you know, when the irrigation district started many, many moons ago and had their systems, they had defined setbacks and actually owned property around all these reservoirs. Well, over the time, and as a rule, the reservoirs are not as full as what they could be. Farmers have slowly kept on moving their crops closer and closer and closer to the reservoirs. Last year, I believe, don't quote me on the exact time. Anyway, it came apparent that basically there was very little setback left. The habitat around these reservoirs was gone. So the ACA and through the various irrigation districts, especially the St. Mary's in this area. Anyway, there's a program now, a system where they are fencing the areas around the reservoirs, and there are now efforts in place to replant shrubs, bushes, the habitat that was actually once around these reservoirs, which, as Daryl mentioned, was great for all types of species. And actually Pheasants Forever and the Medicine Hat Fishing Game organization are part of that in purchasing and helping out planting of the new habitat. So there can be things brought up and there can be positions taken. Again, it just is through all of you folks and your friends and other people bringing up an issue and then working on it to get some resolution. And I would say that's a pretty good happy news story here. I wish I had the number of acres that actually had been farmed around these reservoirs. It was substantial, but they're going to go back to what should have been. And actually the farmers and ranchers, again, once they recognize they really shouldn't have been there anyway, there is not a lot of opposition.
Yes, that's very true. A lot of it is just education. Go ahead, Daryl.
Well, I thought I'd just bring up another issue that perhaps some of the people might want to talk about, and that's the issue of invasive species, because it's certainly an environmental condition or serious. So the issue of feral pigs, we were talking feral horses not too long ago, and we see that the Alberta government, but I mean, it's happening in Ontario, it's Saskatchewan's been involved, it's been in the States. I think there's some 2 million plus feral pigs on the landscape in North America now, and of course they're not native. They're either wild boar, European boar, or in some cases domestic pigs. And so they have a really significant impact on the landscape. I've been fortunate myself as I've actually harvested 7 of these out of the wild, escapees. But I've seen the damage that they can do. So, I mean, it's something that we need to do. But I think of the other one, I think that we perhaps we're forgetting about it a little bit now, or at least I'm getting concerned, and that's the aquatic invasive species issues. Is that we, had a really, I guess, tight control for a number of years on, the movement of boats, particularly into the province. And sometimes these programs, perhaps we don't realize the importance of, keeping some of these hitchhikers out of our waterways. In one of my roles as being fish chair, I have what I call a caucus, where we get together every couple of months and we discuss. And one of the topics that they brought up, and it goes to Glenn's issues related to the irrigation reservoirs in southern Alberta. And I think it's an issue that, I guess we can all take a real stewardship type of approach to make sure that we're doing our part. But it is quite clear that if, say, zebra mussels ever got into some of these reservoirs, is that because they're essentially an industrial infrastructure project, and yes, they support hunting, or support fishing, hunting, they have a lot of water benefits and things like that. But there has been discussion that if they ever got there, is that public access to these type of recreational areas would be shut off. And that would be pretty significant. That'd be a big loss. This whole issue of aquatic invasive species, and how an organization like ours should be, making not only our members aware, but the public aware, which I put in the class of stewardship, I think is critical, because, that loss of access, because, it's sort of like those wind farms. You can't hunt there. That's a loss of access. If you can't fish on a reservoir or boat on a reservoir anymore because of that invasive species, of course, the one I think we're most worried about is zebra and quagga mussels, but particularly zebra, because they will definitely live here. I think we should be really concerned and make sure that our guard is still up there, because you just take a look at Prussian carp, how endemic they are now. They're right at the weir at Gull Lake. I mean, they're all over southern Alberta now. They're just outside of the Carsland Dam, up in the Highwood, up in a bunch of there. I mean, there's places where you can walk across Prussian carp. So, I guess I would put out the question is, how should AFGA be more involved? Or, I think people like Glenn would like to have those type of ideas,
Wade had his hand up. Go ahead, Wade, please.
Yeah. On that specific subject, you raise a good point. And I can, like I said, I'm Hillcrest Fish and Game from the Crow's Nest Pass. And when this issue came up, I was also on the board of directors for the Old Man Watershed Council. Aquatic invasives are as you said, a big problem and a big concern. And at that time, the government of Alberta had a pretty aggressive monitoring program to ensure that they didn't get a foothold. But over the years, I've seen that program dwindle and is non-existent, I think, at this point. Whereas, when I travel into BC or go down to Montana, they have checks all the time. There's one just outside of Fernie, and if you have a watercraft, doesn't matter if it's a canoe, you have to stop and have it checked. I think the Alberta government or AFGA should be pressuring the Alberta government to revitalize that monitoring program.
That's a good point, Wade. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's exactly what I'm kind of looking for. Thank you.
Go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, I didn't want the webinar to end without getting a chance to express a suggestion that I've mentioned before in a roundabout way, and I'd like to articulate it a little better tonight. And that is the linkage between AFGA and the affiliate clubs. As I previously said, I was with Spruce Grove, and when it comes time for an environment chair to speak, or hunting chair or fishing chair, they often say no report. And a lot of times that's simply because they're trying to move things along quickly. But I can't help but wonder if a formal link between AFGA chairs and the affiliate club chairs would not be advantageous for both sides of the issue. So what I'm talking about is that Glenn, for example, you are aware of all the environment chairs in the affiliate clubs and that you regularly communicate with them, and that they are allowed then to bring something to each meeting, not only a one-way communication, but they can inform you what they're doing as well and help you. And I'm thinking, especially when it involves your own personal time, where you can't be everywhere in the province at once. And if you had a formal link with the environment chairs, the affiliate clubs all over the province, that might be able to take some of the pressure off of you. You may be able to delegate or simply get cooperation from these individuals, but they need to be aware of what the issues are, what it is you're doing. And I know I've kind of beat around the bush a bit on this with Daryl, and he's mentioned he's got hundreds of people that he communicates with. What I'm suggesting is specifically some formal communication with the corresponding chairs of the affiliate clubs.
Oh, I totally support what you're saying. So Daryl actually has done that with his fishing caucus. I have not established that relationship yet. Totally agree. That will be something I will do.
Yeah, so I just going to make a comment, Brett, is that I've had a pretty large email fan out in the past, and I admit I haven't used it as much lately. I've tried to change a little bit of my approach, and I'll be providing that input not only to the zone directors, the AFGA executive, but I did establish a caucus, which is essentially the zone fish chairs, some club chairs, not all the club chairs by any means. I mean, partly it is, trying to find out who those people are. One of the things that I think that COVID, I think it's a positive situation is that technology like we're on tonight means that for an individual, for volunteers to get together is actually facilitated. In the past, we relied a lot on, in-person meetings. Well, this is an in-person meeting, but it's through a digital platform. I will talk a little bit about it on tomorrow night's webinar a little bit as well. But I think it's been really positive because the approach that we have taken in each of the meeting is to identify one or two issues and sit down collectively and discuss it. And it's quite interesting of the diversity of the opinions within our membership, which sometimes is not reflected perhaps as well or recognized as much. You know, we have people in these clubs, these members, and they have a real range of perspectives. So, and I think that's really important for AFGA if it wants to be that broad, middle of the road conservation organization, that we have this real range. But certainly communications with the clubs, being able to share, but also for those clubs, and you put it up, because quite frankly, I don't know all the issues that are happening, you know, around Edmonton, for example, around Spruce Grove. I certainly don't heard from Hillcrest down in southern Alberta. I don't know. So having those people come together, and I said we've had 3 very, very good meetings, and you know, I think it's the way forward. And I think in the end we'll have better policies, better positions, and a better understanding of what's happening around the province.
Excellent comments, Daryl. I know that when I was Environment Chair, I had a mail-out list that included the zone Environment Chairs, but didn't go beyond that. No one had even thought of a product like Zoom or using a product like Zoom in those days. And I think what we're hitting on here, just like this meeting is the opportunity that this gives to take AFGA in a new and interesting direction. The one thing I will say is that it seems quite easy for most clubs to, or even zones, to identify a hunting and fishing chair. It's a little bit more difficult to identify an environment chair, and not every zone has one. And then the real problem for everybody is to come up with a programs chair. And I have to admit, one of the issues there is no one's quite sure what a programs chair does that's different than what the other 3 are doing. And those are things that we all have to work on. And certainly the Zoom platform or similar platforms gives us those kind of opportunities. Any other comments or questions? The floor is open. I don't see any hands up. There we go. Gord, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that bad news on CWD is it is now in 514, which is the last WMU south of the Primrose Lake bombing range, weapons range, I guess they call it now. And it's also in 506 and 510, which is the Athabasca River Valley. So it's spread northward, it continues. That much we know, and like you said, the rest of it, the completion of the testing is still up in the air. And again, partly back to the previous commentator there, and it's and your own circumstances there, where we don't, the chairman doesn't know what's happening across the province. He has to be told by people that are in those areas of the province. That's where communication goes both ways. So we need the club chairmen and the zone chairmen to participate in Zoom meetings and back in with helping out everybody in the province. Get a consensus gone before somebody goes to the government saying, well, we're pretty sure Alberta wants this. If you've talked to the people, if you've talked to the zone chairs and the fishing chairs and the clubs, you'll know a fishing policy or a direction for fishing. The environment, well, we know we've got to have enforcement on some of the Wetlands Act. And our job now is to find out if there is enforcement and how do we contact them people when we observe a infraction. So, you know, we're still the guardians, but we also have to talk to each other. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gordon.
Thanks, Gordon.
For those of you who don't know, Gordon is one of the past presidents of the AFGA, and is definitely speaking, we have the voice of experience with this. Anyone else? It's usually about this time that I threaten to start singing, and people will do anything not to hear me sing.
So I'd like some opinions with this team. So within Alberta, so we've always had issues. There's always been something that has and a lot of the issues that I might bring up have come up in the past. But so my thoughts are the major issues within Alberta, and actually the ones through Alberta Fish and Game that we need to focus on are habitat loss, invasive resource development. What I mean is oil, gas, logging. We'll use the coal, for instance. All of a sudden, Alberta came back and they were going to start opening up more coal. The public got involved. There was a big outrage. The Alberta stepped back. They said, okay, wait, hold off. We didn't go there. But so that was something that was just high profile. But, you know, like what was brought up earlier about potential clear cutting around Chip Lake, you know, that's a major issue. Another one that really, and again, as we've talked about, no big solution. If AFGA or anybody would have a solution to chronic wasting disease and how to control that, that would be fantastic. But that is a problem that is going to be much worse in our future, not knowing where that's going to go, but it's a huge deal. And as Daryl mentioned, invasive species. So actually CWD and invasive species, aquatic especially, are relatively new, but their potential of taking off and changing Alberta's hunting and fishing as we know it is actually just around the bend. Invasive species, as Daryl mentioned, and others, I think, you know, a more aggressive approach to monitoring is good. And we need to step that up and keep that up. A little bit of money now saves a lot of money later. CWD, no solution. And resource development that is counterintuitive to, you know, wrecking more habitat, whether that's wetlands, more, you know, research. Like if you've been up around the Caribou area, you know, up around Manning or whatever, if they wouldn't have went in there and done such extensive cut lines and everything like that, we probably wouldn't have the same caribou problems that we have now. That got out of control. So anyway, these are the major issues that I can actually see that the Alberta Fish and Game should definitely take stands on. And is there any other ones anyone could bring up that they believe is something that Alberta Fish and Game should focus on?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Oh, Glenn, oil and gas is near and dear to my heart. I've been in it for 40 years. So I don't think, like I'm just saying at this end, that it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Oil companies, gas companies are doing a lot to control emissions and have plans to do that. So is that something that as a hill we want to die on? Because I can't see us going to the renewable resources 100%. So I just want to know where you stand on that, because like I say, I'm pretty passionate on oil and gas, and like we don't want to, there's no way we can ever get rid of it. We're not gonna, we're only fooling ourselves if we are. It's going to be here for a lot of years yet. And that's my opinion on that.
I do not disagree with you, Michael. Mitchell, Yes, it's going to be here for a while. What I'm more or less talking about is even some approaches for logging that I've seen implemented up north is before they'd come in, clear cut an area, they'd leave the trails in there. So just what's been implemented lately. So now after that's been clear cut and whatever, they go in with cats and they have rippers, and basically once they're done in there and have harvested, they restock the area, and you can access is now limited. So the resource is used. That's fine. It's reestablished through planting, but to actually allow ATV access and hunting in there, which was never in there before, now they're limiting that. So I'm more or less looking on a management system. I'm not saying we shouldn't have development. However, we should have control of that development and how that's being done. And I think it's getting better, but we definitely should be aware of all initiatives for development, I guess is more or less my opinion.
Okay, I see, because let's say with that too as well, like for the company that I work for, I know when they go in and don't make their cut lines, they're putting trees back in, they're planting trees, so they're doing what they can on that. And I'll say on that, let's say even this Seabird Lake area there, that there used to be years ago, you used to be able to drive everywhere there and hunt and quad, but trails are being, the bush has grown back in, so really access in that forest is getting limited too, so it is regrowing back to its natural state. So good, thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, no, and sorry, and we're also not against development again, but if you take X number of acres out, replenish X number of acres elsewhere. So a net loss kind of approach is really what we don't want to lose any more habitat. Daryl.
So
that's good. Yeah.
So I just make I think this is, I'll make a pitch for it. I've lived up here in northern Alberta in the Peace, and I'm in one of the most active energy development areas in the province by far, in the Duvernay and the Montney formations, and the Cambrian. Of course, that's a part of Alberta that starts at about Sundre and it goes all the way up Peace and into northern Dawson Creek, Fort St. John area. So, when we had conventional oil and gas, we had all of those cut lines, but it was like a checkerboard. This area up in here was the first to bring in avoidance seismic, and that was in the 80s, and all of a sudden then helicopter seismic and stuff. And so a lot of the impacts from seismic lines, that type of exploration, have pretty much disappeared up here. What hasn't disappeared and what's happening now is the scale of the energy development, which are really like small refineries all over the place. And we're not talking, the old, 1.5, 2 hectare well sites. We're talking, 50 to 100 hectare plants, 20 hectare lease sites with a network of very high grade roads. And I think this is the prime example of where an offset formula is, that if we're going to go into these areas and do this type of development, okay, how can we offset that? How we can mitigate that? And perhaps it's something about restoration, okay? Closing back some of those cut lines, reducing some of that traditional access. Maybe it's tree planting, or maybe it's moving the offsets not from the immediate area, but perhaps to an area that really needs rehabilitation. Okay, I look at what happened along the Raven River, Stauffer Creek, in the 80s and 90s. Well, basically bring back a stream that didn't exist. Well, there's other streams in the province. There's other areas in the province. So I think that one of the solutions is to look at that. And we have to be honest, is that our livelihoods and stuff for many of us do come from, you know, the resource industry, whether it's logging, whether it's energy development or whatever. But I think that we need to be innovative and look at ways that, you know, we don't deal with that. One of the things I think is important is most of the research has shown that once you get linear access above about, I think, 0.6 kilometers per kilometer squared, many species of wildlife don't do well. On the other hand, certain species of wildlife, such as white-tailed deer and stuff, do very well. So, I mean, but some of the species that are most in trouble in this province are those species where it's not so much that the access may be the problem, but it represents the disturbance on the landscape overall that's the problem. So we have to be cognizant of that, those questions.
So here's one for you, Glenn. Brett has asked the question, climate change, question mark.
Oh, yes. Great question. Yes, where is the balance? I actually don't know how to really answer that. I mean, for AFGA, I mean, we know, so climate change, it is now, I think we all can see that it's happening. You can have all gamut as to why it's happening. I don't really know a position that Alberta Fish and Game would have on climate change. It would be more or less our position on not losing any more habitat. So it's a tough one. It's a major issue. Climate change is huge. I just don't know what we could actually come up with as a meaningful position on that. Good question, though. We'll debate it.
So the one thing that I'll draw everyone's attention to, and we've got the primary author in the room, so to speak, is there is a position paper prepared from December of this past year by the MFPP group, chaired by Daryl, which is an attempt to try to identify what the AFGA should be and what do we need to do to move forward. And one of the key elements here that I'd like to talk to is that Daryl's proposed an updated, inclusive set of objects for the AFGA. And those are important for several reasons. There are strong legal reasons that we need to update them and need to have them. But on a more personal note, this goes to trying to define who is the AFGA? What does the AFGA stand for? What do we worry about? Where should we be directing our lobbying efforts? And so what I want to encourage everybody who's listening in is to go to the AFGA website and under documents download, to download that 37-page report and particularly pay attention to the objects there, because there's been a great deal of work done by a fairly large committee over a little over a year now, and it's a critical statement on what at least that small group thinks we should be focusing on as an AFGA. And I can tell you that we're going to be bringing that to the floor here fairly soon. And we're going to need people who have read it, who have digested it, who understand it, and are willing to share opinions, positions. I agree with this, I disagree with that. We're never going to satisfy everybody, but we've got to really work on this consensus model that overall this is something I can work with, I can live with. So really want to strongly recommend that you have a look at that. Do you want to add anything to that, Daryl?
No, I think you've got it. I just wanted to make sure that everyone recognized, well, I may have been the writer. That was a consensus brought up by the people from all across this province that were committed to that process. Glenn was on that committee as well. And yeah, I think that it's, I would hope that people do take the time. I'll have a little bit, show some of that tomorrow night as well. But Tanya's had her hand up there, so I just going to make I think Glenn's got it right about just before we get to Tanya, is that on the issue of climate change, the reality is that the planet is warming up. Alberta is warming up quickly, maybe more quickly than further south. There are going to be impacts, but I think that Glenn's got it totally right, is that the real issue that Fish and Game needs to be is that habitat question. And that's to see that there is no further loss of habitat in this province, that we can enhance and restore some of that. And, you know, but, you know, I think that would be our contribution to dealing with climate change, because obviously having, you know, intact forests, having watersheds that, you know, wetlands that trap carbon, and all of those things are, you know, real benefits that, you know, we can advance. So that would be my, you know, I think our contribution, if we can focus on habitat, I think that we can do a lot of very positive things. So I'll let you, Victor. I know Tanya's had her hand up for a while.
Yeah, let's go to Tanya. She's been very patient with us.
Hi. I was just, do you think it's safe to say, Glenn, that the basic study of ecological system groundwork from water up onto land everywhere as a group, is that going on? Because I think you would probably, I think that's a very good start to almost to figure out any problem if there's like, for example, too many bugs or not enough bugs, or too many birds or not enough birds, then all that will root. What do you think about that? It might, all that might root to the significance and the cause of any malfunction in the environment or the animals or anything at all. Well, I'm talking about Alberta, of course, but because I live here. But I was just wondering if you have anything to say for that, of field, the basic, the simple, the one thing that yeah.
No, good question. I guess I don't have the knowledge to really say. So I guess our challenge, or my challenge, is so there's a lot of different professionals doing a lot of different things within Alberta, through the government, through other organizations. However, they're kind of each in their own silo. So for Alberta Fish and Game, or for any chair, myself as specific, not really knowing what's going on within the government, that's my challenge. So when we hear of things going on, or we hear of issues, that's a good cue for myself and other chairs to get involved. Sadly, we're not part of the decision-making system within Alberta. We're just a organization that is trying to represent our members responsibly related to habitat, fish, and wildlife. So I would love to know more about the work that's going on and the initiatives, but I actually need to get the tweak to understand what's going on. The Alberta government doesn't call up the Alberta Fish and Game and really they will bring us up the information, but we're not part of the system, I guess would be my answer to that. And that's really the challenge is what's going on, what are they saying? And then I think the bigger challenge is once there is something out there, the Alberta Fishing or the Alberta government or other organizations should be letting Alberta Fish and Game know and letting us be aware of that. And so we have an opportunity to give input. That's really our challenge. Victor, Daryl, anything to add to that? Oh, Daryl or Victor, you're on mute. There we
Yeah,
go.
I'll just add one small item, and that is that one of the things that we've been trying to do is to renew and preserve relationships with other organizations that have similar interests to ours, not necessarily on every topic in every field, but where we can gain traction by making the group that is concerned wider, we all win. So for example, in the North Raven River, we are working with the Alberta Conservation Association, ACA. We're working with Trout Unlimited. We have several other trout fishing clubs and groups that are very actively interested in supporting us. And quite honestly, most of them are not at all interested in joining the AFGA, for example, but we do present a fairly powerful lobby group when we present it to Clearwater County. So that's something we shouldn't forget, is we're also trying to build on those kind of relationships. Daryl, any comments?
Well, I just go back to Tanya's, and I think you're right. I mean, I think water is life. And, you know, there is a lot of research out there, but it's how to present that research so that, you know, we all know what's happening or what the potential is happening. And I think we got to be a little bit worried that sometimes things are like doomsday, or we can be deniers. We can be sort of on two different planes of the thing. Just to let for Tanya's information, I think if you pull up the bull trout recovery plan, which is still not a public document yet, but there's some pretty interesting modeling related to the impact of climate change on stream temperatures. And so this is real data because we know what's happened in the last 40 years. So we can really project out what's going to happen in the next 20 or 30. And the reality is that most of the bull trout habitat in Alberta, particularly that, and I think it was Brett that talked about those headwaters, will become potentially too warm to sustain bull trout populations. So, I mean, and so some of that information, you know, needs to be shared. And, you know, so that goes back to, you know, how do you protect those riparian areas? How do you keep the streams shaded? All of those type of things. So, I mean, the more people, the more information that is shared, but perhaps shared in ways that are meaningful too. It's one thing to pop a piece of research in front of you, but it's one thing, it's quite another thing to have, you know, a real educational type of program.
So I noticed that we have 5 minutes left. So just flagging with the attendees here, thank you very much for staying with us. We've had a pretty consistent group here since we started. But if there are things that you want to add to the conversation, you're down to your last few minutes. So go ahead, Mitchell.
Quick question, Daryl or Victor, we're on the website. What are we looking for? You said that report that was done by that committee. What is that under?
Let me find it for you. So, there we go. AFGA website. So if you go under So ahead to menu,
Okay,
go to resources,
okay,
and in the middle of that, you'll see AFGA document download.
good.
And now let's hope I'm right. There it is. The first one under AFGA revitalization is the report that I'm talking about.
Good, got her. Thank you very much, Victor.
You're welcome. Anything else, anyone?
So I guess I just wanted to kind of say thank you for all attending. So this was the first attempt. So we have a communication chair now, and this was and that's why there'll be two more webinars coming up here the next few days to try to offer out things to our membership. I'm hoping people found this of value. We do plan to keep on communication system going forward. Yes, again, so for the environment chair as myself example, you can email me through the AFGA website on any other particulars as well. And I guess the intention of all of this is really for all of us to start getting together and chit-chatting about issues within the Alberta province that are important to our membership. So thank you for attending.
So one last question. I'll ask the panelists and the attendees to raise their hand if they found this a useful 2-hour session for this kind of an open chat. Well, I think you've got your answer there,
Yeah.
Glenn.
Thank you very much.
Hopefully we will be able to expand this to more of the AFGA as we move forward. So thank you everybody for participating. This now
Can I just get one
Sure.
plug? Is that we
Go
do
ahead.
have, I think you can still register for the hunting and fishing sessions.
Yep.
Hope to see all of you, and perhaps you can get some of your friends to join as well. I mean, not only is this type of dialogue extremely important, but it's how you shape the organization so that you're getting benefit for your membership.
So thank you, everybody. This draws this particular session to a close. Really an enjoyable chat, and I'm very glad you were able to join us. Any last words, Glenn?
No, thank you again for all attending. I personally found this very beneficial. I was looking for direction, and you've helped me look at some items that I will be pursuing. And I really have valued each and every one of your comments and discussions. So thank you so much.
Good night, all.
See ya. Have a good one.